lots of people here have questions that they'd like to ask, so I'll just put one, and then if people want to address a question either to a specific panelist or to the panel in general, feel free, get your hands up, and I'm sure microphones will come round. But I guess my question is, we've heard a lot from all three of you about what schools should not be doing in relation to children and gender, that they shouldn't be spinning kind of transgender identity in a positive light, that they shouldn't be positively affirming children who are confused about their gender identity or think they may be the opposite gender. But my question is, what should schools be doing? It's an argument I'm constantly having with myself and with others. I guess my simplistic answer is nothing. Schools shouldn't be doing anything, because anything that schools do kind of runs the risk of promoting this, of putting ideas in children's heads. But the more this becomes a social reality, much as we might deny it's a biological reality, the transgender child becomes every day more of a social reality. The chances are many teachers will have transgender children in their class. Much as we might wish that were otherwise, it becomes a reality. So my question to all of you, really in the order in which you first spoke, is just what do you think schools should be doing in response to this?
I think we sort of need to go back to what we were doing before, which was largely, under the guise of anti-bullying, was to expand what's considered acceptable types of behavior for girls and boys and men and women, and understand that what makes you a boy or a girl has to do with your biology, but we should definitely leave plenty of social room open for people who are gender nonconforming and just see it as a natural aspect of our biology. And I think we were doing that, I think, for a pretty good clip up until recently, when we decided to just reify these rigid social rules and stereotypes, and then add this layer of pseudoscience about being born in the wrong body, and it just kind of became, the whole trans thing took over. It might be hard to go back now because the whole trans stuff is in the water now. So I don't know what the schools can do except for maybe not teach it, but I would just empower parents to try to inoculate your kids against this stuff, because I think, it's pretty easy to talk to your kids about these issues beforehand. And I think if you just are square with them and you explain them about what it means to be a boy or a girl and what gender ideology is, get to them before the teachers and the activists do, and I think that can go a long way, because I think the kids are smart enough to understand what's going on.
Thank you. Leor?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that a lot of what we're seeing in schools and the consequence of what we're seeing in schools, the medical consequences, a lot of that is downstream of what Jeremy was talking about, this kind of crisis of meaning, this hollowing out. And there's really not much schools can do about that. That's not a crisis that started in schools, and it's not one that's going to end in schools. I would say that two things immediately strike me as something that schools have to do. Number one is they have to recognize that what a lot of people are calling an inclusive environment, kind of all these abstract, soaring abstractions and euphemisms, they have to understand that the practical consequence of that is something called social transition, and that social transition is now recognized as having medical consequences. I found that teachers have a hard time kind of wrapping their minds around this, because they say, I'm just being nice, I'm just being polite. I'm not doing anything medical. It doesn't seem obvious why what I'm doing is medical. And somebody that, one of my colleagues once said, telling kids that it's okay to eat junk food and discouraging them from ever exercising is not medical advice, but it has obvious medical consequences. And that's something that teachers and school administrators need to understand. So number one, they have to understand that what they are calling being inclusive has serious consequences that are not within their realm of competence to decide. And number two, I think they have to adhere to the same principle of medical ethics of do no harm. First, do no harm. If you're not sure that what you are doing is going to be good or bad, don't do it. And the best thing that they could do, and this is number three, is the thing they have to do, they should do, is involve parents. It has to be a parent's decision, ultimately.
Definitely. Thank you.
Don't take federal money, that's for starters. But on a personal level, the child needs to be treated with compassion. they are in, these kids are in this situation not for anything that they have done. This is being done to them. That said, if I were a trustee of a private school or running a private school, I would fill the days with so much academic rigor and actual academic work that there would not be time to discuss these issues. It would obviously not be, and that just goes to the point of be aware what's in your school's curriculum, be aware what's being taught in the classroom, be active, have active oversight, and understand that there, unfortunately, are people with agendas that may not conform with your values, and you have to act accordingly and with your feet. Don't be smitten by the reputation of your school, because in many instances it's not deserved.
Thank you. I mean, just to push back ever so slightly, I guess a critic would say that you three are all just on the wrong side of history, that if this was the 1980s or the early 1990s, you'd be sitting here saying that schools shouldn't be talking to children about homosexuality, that should not come up in the context of a school discussion. I mean, how would you, any of you, would you respond to that?
I think I would say that, you know, what we're pushing back against now isn't an intrinsic part of what a human is. It's really an ideological framework. Like what made the LGB movement so successful is because they didn't ask anyone to really believe anything that's biologically false. There was no ideological sort of overlay on anything. It was just, you know, just understand that the love you have for opposite sex people is something I have for same sex people. And even if people didn't, you know, they couldn't understand that for themselves, they could certainly say like, well, you know, I love my partner and I can understand how people might expand that to people of their same sex or something like that. But what we're seeing now is really just an ideological framework. They're asking us to not only go back to sort of regressive stereotypes, but also just deny fundamental aspects of biology and you know, go against what our eyes can tell us that's true. So yeah, I think that's a major difference.
I would argue that lesbians and gays actually are allies in fighting the gender identity movement. If you think about it, gender identity, this notion of transgenderism is a repudiation of sexuality, biology, and that they are allies. And I will tell you that in the Title IX discussion, in the debates, you know, you have some, and this is touched on earlier today, you have feminist, left-wing feminist groups allying with traditional conservative groups to oppose the Title IX regulation as it relates to gender identity. So that's very important, and I think that we should embrace that. You know, a perfect example of that is the Women's Liberation Front, also known as, you know, TERF Collective, right? And it's good to have those sorts of allies, because this is a fight, in my opinion, which crosses ideological lines, because it deals with basic issues of biology that can't be questioned.
So, did you want to say? Don't feel like you have to.
No, just very briefly. I mean, you know, homosexuality is something that we know based on research with a much higher degree of confidence is natural. Natural in the sense that it occurs in nature. That a person who is gay or who is lesbian cannot be converted into heterosexuality, or at least not without a great deal of psychological suffering. The research tells us the opposite when it comes to gender identity. The vast majority of people who exhibit, especially young people who exhibit these behaviors, if they're encouraged to accept their bodies, if they're encouraged to kind of be mature about it and to understand that what they're calling gender dysphoria is just distress. It may be a more extreme version of normal teenage distress, but we all go through these same things. There's nothing unique about what you're going through. You don't have to change your body just because you feel uncomfortable with puberty or with getting your first period. I think the two scenarios are different, but let me just complicate, let me take your question and push even harder. You could say the same thing about the women's revolution and the knocking down of barriers for integrating women. And I would say, look, I mean, I think there is, and I agree with James here, I mean, there is a thread that goes through feminism and gay rights all the way to the trans movement, and it's undeniable. And where Colin and I maybe have a little bit of a disagreement here is if you try to push back against transgender ideology by celebrating a kind of a better understanding of gender nonconformity, in a way you're not getting out of the quagmire. You're still telling people that it's good to be nonconforming, that it's good to flaunt social conventions, in and of itself. Both feminism and gay rights try to disassociate the human sex category from reproductive potential and function, saying that in the case of women that it should be totally optional, that having true autonomy and freedom and control over your life means not letting your biology dictate anything about your choices. For obvious reasons, the gay rights movement had to make the same argument, and that's one of the arguments that underwrites the trans movement too. And for us to deny that would be foolish. So we have to realize that it's going to be hard to push back against trans ideology without also simultaneously calling into question at least some of the elements of feminism and gay rights. But that certainly doesn't mean that we want to roll back feminism and gay rights. We just have to realize where there are slight overlaps there.
Colin, do you want to come back on that at all?
Yeah, I would just say that there's, at least in my mind, I would say we don't have to celebrate something. We can accept something as a natural variation without sort of putting it on a pedestal and encouraging people and saying we're going to celebrate this and not celebrate any other types of gender identities or types of gender nonconforming. I think we should just treat kids who are conforming just the same way we would treat nonconforming kids. You're just an individual.
Yeah, no, that's
Kids are kids.
So if I could add, I come from the world of politics, policy, and public administration. And I've observed in American history where you've had unlikely allies come together and bring together very strong coalitions to overturn the status quo. A perfect example is the New Deal coalition of the 1930s, where you had urban intellectuals and ethnics allying with Southern conservatives and civil libertarians to create a governing majority that lasted for 4 decades. To your point, yeah, there's inconsistencies there. There's an intellectual strain, but this issue is so important and goes to the notion of what it is to be a human or man or a woman, that I think that most lesbian and gays at the grassroots level are with us.
Definitely. Can I see anybody who wants to speak, please?
Yes,
Yeah,
I was going to ask a question. I was waiting for a break. You can't see me because of the lights.
No, I can't see you, sorry.
It is your
yes, I
happy.
see you.
It's your happy MC. Now you can see me. No, obviously, understandably, we've been talking about the people who are going through, rightly or wrongly, these possible changes or this dysphoria. But like the race, poverty, and all these other issues, I want one of you, if not all of you, to talk about the problems we face in this, because we put such a focus on this that we ignore the vast majority of the kids who aren't dealing with this. So, right, when you talk about this, if I think Colin talked about where you have to be, and also Bob, like you have to be compassionate for the people who are going through this, which is true. But 99.4% of the people aren't, and they're being roped into this. So not only are they young, right, but you have this 8-year-old who now you have to sit through the genderbread person. You have to sit through that just in case someone might happen to be dealing with this. So there's got to be a way. Talk about why, when you talk about what should be done, how do they do that as fairly as possible without causing the ripple effects you're talking about, because they're forcing it on kids that weren't even thinking about that, because now we all have to hear and talk about it and all those kind of things.
Thank you. I'm going to be mean and ask you to keep your answers as brief as possible, and sorry, I'm being mean to you too, but just because I saw quite a few hands were up, and it would be a real shame not to be able to fit in everybody's questions. So if anybody, don't feel like you have to reply to that unless you've got something burning to say.
Well, I would say we don't need to do the genderbread person for anyone, even if you happen to have a so-called trans kid in your class. Like, it's not helping them either. It's helping no one. It's just peddling nonsense.
Anybody else? No? You can take it up with them later if you want an individual answer. Okay, so there's a hand over here. Sorry.
So I'm Michael King from Massachusetts Family Institute, and So I think a lot of the answer to, and especially I was impressed by what you were saying about the Title IX, Bob, that what is happening right now in Massachusetts as a reaction to all of this is a growth in learning centers that the faith community especially, so I've spoken at 200 churches in the past 6 years, so I have a pretty good idea of the landscape of the faith community in Massachusetts. And we're working with 30 churches right now that are starting learning centers. So not schools, not teachers, these are proctors, these are very simple answers to the public school exit, even in Massachusetts. In 2020, we saw homeschooling in Massachusetts go from 1.5% to 12.1%. It was an 800% growth. And we continue to see these trends. So I wanted to mention that first in terms of what we're seeing in Massachusetts as a reaction to the nonsense going on in our public schools and in our private schools. Bob, a question to you particularly is, in Ludlow, Massachusetts right now, there's a federal lawsuit that we're involved with on the trans issue, where a parent was not told about a transition of their child at school. As Title IX goes forward, we have this decision in 2023, as you're talking about. The Supreme Court obviously is more conservative now. Will the court rulings, teachers that don't want to use pronouns, kids that are complaining about compelled speech, will these lawsuits, which coming out of Massachusetts, I can tell you there will be some, are those going to trump this new legislation, these new executive orders?
Yeah, so it's just to be clear, this is a regulation that is going through the formal notice and public comment process, which will result in a final regulation that has the force of law. It's almost like a statute. It's based on the agency interpretation of Title IX. To answer your question, I think that the Title IX regulation as it now stands, and you may disagree with me there, but I think that if it continues to retain the gender identity language, that it is prone to being thrown out by the courts. There is litigation pending in the Eastern District of Tennessee at a Knoxville Federal District Court that deals with this issue in kind of a different context. That the Federal District Court did not accept the administration's interpretation of Title IX on this issue. That is on appeal. Given the changes we've seen at the Supreme Court of the United States in the last several years in terms of personnel composition, I think that I'm actually mildly optimistic as to how court challenges to the Title IX reg itself could go. I'm not directly familiar with the litigation out of Ludlow, but I will tell you that administration interpretations of Title IX to encompass gender identity, even before this rule is finalized, are not being well received by the courts necessarily. Now, I will tell you there is another aspect to this that we have not discussed, and that has to do with the Equal Protection Clause. There's an argument being made that the Equal Protection Clause of the federal Constitution requires that gender identity be recognized as a protected class and that there be constitutional protections based on transgender status. And those are percolating their way through the court. So it may end up making moot this discussion on Title IX if the courts at the end of the day were to come down and say, this is a constitutionally protected class, so we'll see.
Well, I came up here as the unfun MC because Joanna wanted to take one more question. I want to take two, but I wanted to tell the people when they ask a question, because we're short on time, to just ask the question. Love you all, but that means we can get more information and that to make the answers a skosh shorter.
I'm a lawyer. What do you want from me?
I know, but since you mentioned that, I was talking to a couple of people earlier. So what do you think of the Equality Act and what happens with that? And if that passes, what does that do for the Civil Rights Act and, the Equal Protection Clause and all that?
Well, excuse me, sorry, you're jumping in. There's people in the audience who've had their hands up.
I see them, but I got a mic. I mean, I can co-op. I'm going to go to them, though, really quickly.
The Equality Act would make all this conversation moot. We would it would essentially achieve through statute what the Biden administration is attempting to achieve through regulation, and it would have much more powerful resonance.
But also negate the protections that blacks and women wanted to have and think they have, because it creates the whole fluid thing that you're trying to protect.
Yes.
You don't know what it is.
There are, this could be a topic for a day. There are intense internal conflicts amongst gender identity and homosexuality and lesbianism. I mean, but that's for another day, I think.
Yeah, hey, Gregory Tiangelo with the New Tolerance Campaign. Thanks to all the panelists. I guess, Bob, this question is for you as the,
I'm getting all the questions.
as the
What
legal
about
mind on the panel, but it's certainly open to the feedback for any of the other panelists. Specifically, I wonder how the Bostock decision from the United States Supreme Court, just from 2 years ago, supposedly from a conservative Justice Gorsuch, which ruled that both gender identity and sex were the same thing, at least insofar as they pertain to discrimination in employment. I wonder how that decision might impact any movement on Title IX, if it was that decision that emboldened the Biden administration to take this latest move on Title IX, and how that decision might play out if, say, for example, attorneys general start moving against a rule like that.
So the Bostock decision, I should mention this, is the decision upon which the Biden administration is basing their Title IX regulation. They're making the argument that under Title VII, the Supreme Court has said that actually transgender status is protected under Title VII, which is it bars employment discrimination in employment. So Title IX is a very different statute. And indeed, Justice Gorsuch, in his opinion on Bostock, goes out of his way to describe how, to make it very clear that the Bostock decision does not apply to Title IX, and that's a whole different legal analysis. And in fact, Title IX has within it, in its regulations, which incidentally were signed by President Ford, some very deep notions of biology, of sex based on binary biology. That is, it expressly allows for sex-segregated facilities, sex-segregated athletics. So you can't really compare Title VII and Title IX. I know that there's sort of a surface level, particularly on the left, to sort of equate the two, but they're two very different statutes, and I think the courts will approach them that way.
Can I just say something really quickly on that question?
Go.
Okay. In Bostock, Gorsuch recognizes that there's an ongoing debate about whether sex means biological traits or gender identity, and he says, we're not resolving that debate, and therefore our decision doesn't apply to all these debates over restrooms, sex-specific accommodations, and activities. Within weeks, the Fourth Circuit issued a decision in the Gloucester case saying, the Supreme Court just said that sex means gender identity. So this is a very good example, and there are others, of the lack of hierarchical control that the Supreme Court exercises over the courts of appeal. So I just wanted to put that.
A question for someone not named Bob.
Great. Well, I have one question specifically about why don't we call puberty blockers what they are, which is chemical castration? And I think if we keep using the euphemism, it sounds so sweet and nice, right? It's also gender-affirming surgery. I'm sorry, these are all euphemisms.
Yeah.
I honestly think we should talk about what they are, because we talk about tucking. Well, tucking is actually painful and causes problems. Binding causes problems, right? If we stop using the terms that they want us to use, we might actually fight back on some of that. I think the other thing is what wasn't said is no one said the word WPATH here, and I was kind of surprised because WPATH is why there's those reports or whatever, the research is there, as they are out advocating for this, and they are making our institutions, say all these things we don't want them to say. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that my niece and nephew are both Division I athletes. My niece was a softball player. She got feedback from her parents for most of her life that this was going to pay for college. She got to college, and it sucked. Her experience as a Division I athlete was awful. She did not get around to being able to admit that to her parents until her senior year. And because she thought that if I were to tell them that this sucks and I don't want to play anymore, how am I going to afford college, right? So I see that in the transgender world exactly the same, meaning that kids are affirmed all along. At some point, if they decide that maybe they don't want to do this anymore, they don't feel that they can say it. There's so many adults in their lives who have radically affirmed them that they feel now that they've built up too much to be able to desist at that point. How many of these kids are moving forward because they've never been told by any adult that maybe it's okay to not be this way?
Who wants that?
Let me take those in reverse orders. Great questions. Not only, so this is something that Abigail Schreier notes in her book on her interviews. Not only is it difficult for the child to say to the adults in her life, sorry, oops, thanks for going to bat for me, thanks for standing up for me and sticking out your neck and reputation. It turned out that I was wrong. I think we've come to learn over the last few years that parents, and I have to say especially moms, who get invested in this and become glitter moms, can you imagine knowing that you did this to your child and then figuring out that you made a wrong decision? It requires superhuman integrity on the part of a parent to say, I was wrong about this and I horribly hurt my child. And so parents get so invested in this stuff and they become the most zealous, fanatic defenders of childhood transition. So that's number one. On WPATH, interestingly, over the last year or so, American policymaking elites, so Democrats, OCR bureaucrats, and civil rights groups, ACLU, rarely ever invoke WPATH. And now we're starting to see why. It is just a psycho organization. I mean, they now explicitly recognize eunuch as a gender identity, and they claim that young children can know that they're eunuchs. I mean, it's just off the deep end. And now they just got rid of all the minimum ages for puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. So I think you're starting to see kind of elites on the left distance themselves awkwardly from WPATH, and they can do that because the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society provide them the ammunition. And privately later, if you want, we could talk about the evidence that WPATH cites, which is non-existent. On the third issue of the euphemisms, I actually think puberty blockers is the correct term to use here. I think it's vivid enough. I think it puts the image in the mind enough. I'm of the opinion that using language like castration, unless we're dealing with castration, because puberty blockers don't necessarily castrate. If you stop using them, they don't castrate. I think we should use accurate language, and if it's vivid, as this is, I think that's good enough.